In the dense forests and winding rivers of Mississippi in 1827, a shadow moved through small towns and plantations, leaving whispers of horror in its wake. Known to locals only as the outlaw who kept fingers as trophies, he was a figure whose presence seemed both real and spectral, a phantom that instilled fear without uttering a word. Families spoke of doors left ajar in the dead of night, of footsteps that did not belong to any living soul, and of the horrifying discoveries that confirmed their deepest fears. No one could predict his next strike, and no one knew if he observed them even as they slept. He appeared ordinary, tall and lean, yet his eyes betrayed a calculated intent. Lawmen who pursued him often returned with nothing but mud-stained footprints, fleeting shadows, and an unsettling sense of being watched. Travelers, servants, and townsfolk moved cautiously through streets and forests, aware that a single misstep could be their last. The mere mention of his name stopped conversations, caused children to shiver, and forced adults to reconsider every action after dusk. Night brought the true terror. The wind through the pine trees carried whispers of movement, and every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves became amplified, magnified by the ever-present fear. Lanterns flickered in cabins, casting long, wavering shadows, and people clutched each other, half expecting the outlaw to emerge from the darkness. Even the most mundane tasks, fetching water, closing doors, tending to livestock, became exercises in caution and vigilance. He struck with precision and intent. Unlike random acts of violence, his attacks demonstrated careful planning. Victims were chosen, their routines observed, and each assault executed with chilling methodicalness. Severed fingers, kept as grotesque trophies, were not just evidence of murder, they were a psychological weapon, reinforcing his control over the living and ensuring that fear spread faster than any bounty or law enforcement intervention. News of his crimes traveled through local newspapers, spreading both horror and fascination. Families read the accounts aloud by firelight, emphasizing the grotesque details, embedding the fear into collective consciousness. Strangers were watched, neighbors distrusted, and even the forests themselves were regarded with suspicion. This fear reshaped daily life. Children slept lightly, doors were barred early, and no journey was taken after nightfall without caution. The outlaw's presence created a community gripped by terror, yet oddly bound together by shared vigilance. Men patrolled the edges of towns and plantations, while women and children adapted their routines to avoid unseen danger. Every shadow became suspect, every noise a potential signal. The ordinary landscape of Mississippi, its rivers, cabins, and dense woods transformed into a stage for suspense, each element amplified by the mind's instinctive dread. By sunset, townsfolk whispered stories that blurred into legend. The outlaw was more than a criminal. He was a force that manipulated perception and environment, turning fear into a tangible, almost physical presence. His legacy would endure long after his attacks ceased, a testament to the power of calculated terror to dominate minds and communities alike. In 1827 Mississippi, darkness had a name, and that name was whispered wherever the wind moved through the trees. In 1827, Mississippi was a land marked by dense forests, winding rivers, and scattered settlements. Life for its inhabitants, both free and enslaved, was defined by survival in a rugged, often unforgiving environment. The social hierarchy was rigid, with wealthy plantation owners holding power over land and labor, while poor farmers, itinerant workers, and enslaved people navigated daily hardships with little security. Communities were small and isolated, with neighbors separated by miles of wilderness, making communication and law enforcement challenging. The landscape itself, thick with cypress and pine, provided both resources and concealment, a duality that shaped life and danger alike. The economy was dominated by agriculture, particularly cotton, which demanded extensive labor and created stark divides between social classes. Enslaved African Americans formed the backbone of this system, subjected to brutal work conditions, restricted movement, and constant surveillance. Their lives were deeply intertwined with both the land and the households they served, making them especially vulnerable to threats, whether from disease, punitive oversight, or criminal actors such as the notorious outlaw. Free citizens also contended with scarcity, harsh weather, and limited access to education and health care. Communities relied on mutual support, yet the isolation meant that fear and rumors could spread rapidly. often shaping behavior as much as formal laws or official decrees. Mississippi society at the time was imbued with religious and cultural norms that dictated morality, behavior, and gender roles. Families gathered for Sunday worship, and moral codes emphasized obedience, piety, and reputation. Women were expected to manage households and care for children, while men oversaw labor, property, and defense. Law enforcement was nascent, with sheriffs and constables operating with limited resources, making communities largely responsible for their own protection. Vigilance was a social necessity, particularly after dark, when danger, whether from wild animals, criminals, or unpredictable natural events, was thought to be at its peak. Communication relied heavily on word of mouth, community meetings, and local newspapers, which often sensationalized crimes to attract readers. Reports of murders, disappearances, or strange occurrences spread fear, but also served as informal warnings. Travelers moving through the region were advised to remain alert, avoid traveling alone, and respect local knowledge of paths and safe havens. The fear generated by crime was therefore both social and practical, reinforcing communal bonds while heightening anxiety. In this context, the presence of an intelligent, elusive criminal who left behind grotesque trophies amplified the sense of helplessness, challenging conventional ideas of law, safety, and human decency. Cultural practices around justice and retribution also shaped responses to violence. Lynch mobs and vigilante groups were not uncommon, reflecting a society in which official intervention was limited, and individuals often took justice into their own hands. Folklore and oral tradition preserved the memory of crimes, sometimes exaggerating details to underscore moral lessons or societal fears. The outlaw's actions intersected with these traditions, embedding themselves into local lore and elevating his notoriety beyond the immediate scope of his attacks. Communities remembered not only the victims, but also the pervasive anxiety, the alterations in daily life, and the lessons learned through exposure to persistent, unseen threat. The physical environment further complicated law enforcement efforts. Dense woods, swamplands, and winding rivers provided natural cover for criminals and hindered tracking. Weather extremes, heavy rains, floods, and intense summer heat could delay communication, travel, and investigative response. Settlements were scattered, and many relied on self-defense and neighborly observation rather than formal policing. This isolation intensified fear, as even minor incidents could be misinterpreted or magnified by rumor, leaving citizens unsure of safety in their homes or along familiar paths. Education and literacy varied widely. Wealthier families maintained private tutors or small schools, while many children, particularly those of enslaved or poor families, received minimal instruction. Knowledge of reading, writing, and numeracy influenced awareness of threats, access to information, and participation in community networks. The circulation of newspapers and pamphlets allowed some awareness of broader criminal patterns, yet reliance on oral tradition kept rumor and fear tightly intertwined, creating fertile ground for legends like that of the outlaw who kept fingers as trophies. The societal pressures, geographic isolation, and uneven distribution of power in Mississippi created conditions in which terror could flourish. Ordinary spaces, cabins, streets, and river crossings became vulnerable points of exposure. Communities adapted to constant uncertainty, balancing everyday routines with vigilance, reinforcing doors, traveling in groups, and maintaining informal watch systems. The outlaw's presence challenged these adaptations, demonstrating that calculated malevolence could exploit even the most cautious precautions. In essence, the Society of Mississippi in 1827 was primed to experience not just crime, but psychological terror on a scale that intertwined with daily life, social norms, and collective memory. The first known encounter with the outlaw occurred on a humid evening near a small plantation on the outskirts of Natchez. A young farmhand returning from the fields noticed movement in the shadows, the snapping of twigs underfoot that did not belong to any animal. As he paused, a figure emerged from the trees, tall and silent, eyes glinting in the fading light. The man lunged, striking with a concealed blade. The farmhand survived but lost 2 fingers in the attack, which the outlaw claimed as his first trophies, leaving them as a grim message to anyone who might follow the boy's route. Weeks later, another incident occurred along a river crossing where a merchant and his family were traveling to the market The outlaw appeared as though from nowhere, his movements fluid, deliberate. He wielded a hatchet with terrifying precision, disabling the merchant's horse and injuring 2 of the children. Neighbors arriving hours later discovered the aftermath. Severed fingers placed near the riverbank and scattered possessions, a display meant to terrorize and assert dominion over the living. The community began to notice a pattern. Each attack was methodical, symbolic, and intended to psychologically manipulate both victims and onlookers. In a cabin farther north, the outlaw infiltrated a small home where a widow lived with her young daughter. Under the cover of night, he entered quietly, avoiding creaking floorboards with practiced skill. He struck quickly, leaving deep gashes on the walls, broken furniture, and yet again, trophies collected from his victims. The surviving daughter was found by a neighbor the next morning, traumatized and silent, her experience a testament to the outlaw's deliberate orchestration of fear. Local accounts describe the air as thick with dread, the floors of the cabin bearing marks of struggle, the shadows itself seemingly alive. On several occasions, travelers on isolated trails reported hearing footsteps behind them, whispers of movement and glimpses of a shadowy figure with unnervingly calm eyes. The outlaw's pattern became increasingly audacious. He targeted those moving in groups, striking precisely when vigilance might have been assumed to offer safety. Survivors spoke of a cold, calculating patience, a man who studied the environment and his targets, turning every element of the landscape into an accomplice. Wooded areas, riverbanks, and even familiar paths were no longer safe. Each step could provoke sudden violence. A particularly harrowing account involved a family returning from a market, the father carrying goods along a narrow footpath. The outlaw emerged silently from dense brush, attacking with a small knife that struck at the father's hands and wrists. The mother, attempting to shield her children, was left paralyzed with fear as the man collected fingers from both parents. The children survived, hidden beneath a wagon, witnessing the brutality with an impression that would haunt them for life. These incidents, while brutal in detail, also reflected a deeper strategy. The outlaw's trophies were not mere evidence of crime, but instruments of terror designed to manipulate the collective consciousness of the community. The outlaw's intrusion into homes became increasingly bold. One night in a cabin on the edge of a swamp, he cornered a widow and her eldest son. He moved with such silent grace that no warning came. He used a small hatchet to destroy doors and furniture, marking the walls with scratches that resembled tally marks, and removed fingers from the terrified pair. By morning, neighbors arrived to find the family alive but broken, the interior of the cabin altered irrevocably by his presence. These acts reinforced the notion that no place was secure, that the forests and even private dwellings were subject to his reach. Each incident was meticulously planned, leaving few clues. Survivors reported a calmness in his demeanor, an absence of rage, replaced by clinical, almost ritualistic behavior. The outlaw collected his trophies with care, positioning them to maximize fear. He rarely spoke, letting the symbolism of his actions communicate intent. Reports from witnesses described a silence that was deafening, a stillness in the woods that preceded violence. It was as if nature itself paused to observe his deeds, amplifying the suspense and horror of each encounter. Patterns began to emerge as communities documented incidents. Fingers were removed in consistent fashion. Marks on walls or trees often resembled symbolic messaging, and each attack was executed at night, exploiting the natural vulnerabilities of darkness. The outlaw avoided detection with a knowledge of the terrain that suggested familiarity or premeditation, using rivers, swamps, and dense woods to disappear before any pursuit could begin. Families were forced to live under constant vigilance, sleep disrupted by nightmares, routines altered to avoid potential attacks. Another grim incident involved a traveling merchant, caught in an ambush on a narrow trail. The outlaw struck suddenly, incapacitating the merchant with a swift blow to the head, severing fingers as trophies before disappearing into the nearby forest. The merchant survived but suffered permanent injury and trauma, and the incident became a tale repeated across plantations and towns. It reinforced the omnipresent fear, demonstrating that no social status or geographic proximity offered immunity. The outlaw's spree continued for months, each incident more audacious than the last. Reports detail isolated cabins ransacked, livestock killed, and personal belongings displayed alongside the trophies. Survivors' accounts highlight psychological trauma as much as physical injury. Sleepless nights, hypervigilance, and pervasive dread dominated everyday life. Communities began to adapt, traveling in groups, lighting bonfires at night, and maintaining constant watch. Yet despite these measures, the outlaw remained elusive, always one step ahead, transforming Mississippi's landscape into a theater of terror where every shadow and sound could signal the arrival of death. Even when attempts at pursuit occurred, the outlaw left minimal evidence, his meticulousness confounding lawmen and local militia. Some attacks appeared to anticipate patrol patterns, as if he knew when and where observers would be. This intelligence heightened fear. The idea of an omniscient predator amplified community anxiety far beyond the immediate victims. Houses became fortified, nightly routines became rigid, and children were restricted from wandering outside. Yet the psychological imprint of his actions persisted, leaving an enduring sense of vulnerability and dread across the region. In total, the incidents created a network of fear that extended beyond direct victims. The outlaw's trophies, strategic violence, and careful planning established a reign of terror that shaped the daily life of towns and plantations alike. Witnesses spoke not only of physical harm, but of the profound sense of violation, an understanding that safety was an illusion and the wilderness itself a dangerous companion. Each story added to the legend. Each report reinforced the notion of an intelligent, calculating criminal who turned Mississippi's forests, rivers, and homes into instruments of horror and control. The response of Mississippi's residents to the outlaw's reign of terror was as complex as it was intense. Families who had survived attacks were haunted not only by memories of physical violence, but by psychological scars that reshaped daily routines and social interactions. Neighbors banded together in informal vigilance groups, walking the edges of settlements and coordinating nightly watches. Doors were reinforced, windows shuttered, and lanterns kept lit well past midnight. Children were instructed never to leave the home after sundown, and even routine chores such as fetching water or tending livestock became exercises in caution, undertaken in groups whenever possible. The communal response was a mix of fear, resilience, and desperate adaptation to a threat that seemed both omnipresent and invisible. Local authorities struggled to maintain order and enforce the law. Sheriffs and constables were limited in numbers and resources, unable to track the outlaw through the dense forests and swamps. Militia patrols were dispatched, but rarely returned with evidence, often finding only footprints, scattered possessions, or the remnants of his grotesque trophies. Frustration grew among lawmen, who faced public pressure to apprehend the criminal, yet had little ability to do so effectively. Newspapers chronicled the incidents in sensational detail, both to inform and to captivate readers, inadvertently amplifying the climate of fear. The press highlighted the exotic horror of the crimes, emphasizing the severed fingers and the calculated cruelty, embedding the outlaw into local folklore even as attempts at justice continued. Religious leaders and pastors offered moral and spiritual interpretations of the crimes, warning of the presence of evil in the wilderness and urging repentance, vigilance, and communal support. Sermons often referenced divine justice, framing the outlaw's actions as a test of faith and morality. For many parishioners, this spiritual lens provided some measure of understanding in an otherwise incomprehensible landscape of violence, though it could not alleviate the immediate terror. Churches became centers of both prayer and practical coordination, with congregants organizing watches and aid for families affected by attacks. The intertwining of faith, fear, and practical action became a defining feature of community response. Psychological reactions were pervasive. Survivors exhibited signs of trauma, including hypervigilance, insomnia, and heightened startle responses. Families recounted constant anxiety, particularly at night, with every creak of floorboards or rustle of leaves interpreted as a potential threat. Rumors spread quickly, some factual, some embellished, heightening collective fear. Even individuals not directly affected adjusted behaviors, avoiding travel after dark, keeping children close, and observing strangers with suspicion. The outlaw's calculated selection of victims ensured that the fear extended beyond immediate encounters, creating an atmosphere where even ordinary events carried the weight of potential violence. Neighbors attempted to share information through informal networks, warning each other of patterns, suspected hideouts, and potential attack locations. Meetings were held under the cover of darkness to coordinate watches and patrols. Families exchanged advice on securing homes, storing weapons, and signaling danger. Communities developed shared strategies to mitigate risk, yet the outlaws' mobility and cunning rendered many efforts only partially effective. The persistent inability to predict his movements or prevent attacks reinforced a sense of helplessness, making communal vigilance both necessary and emotionally taxing. Media coverage played a significant role in shaping perceptions of the outlaw. Newspapers described the violence in vivid detail, sometimes exaggerating for dramatic effect, contributing to a climate of terror. Stories highlighted the grotesque trophies, the methodical nature of the attacks, and the seeming omniscience of the perpetrator. Letters and reports circulated between towns, allowing news of the crimes to travel farther than the physical range of the outlaw himself. This dissemination created a shared consciousness of fear across multiple communities, influencing behavior even in areas where he had not yet appeared. Scientific and medical interpretations, though limited, began to emerge. Some physicians speculated about psychological disturbances, abnormal behavior, and the influence of extreme isolation on criminal tendencies. Though contemporary understanding of psychology was rudimentary, local authorities occasionally consulted medical opinions regarding the motivations and mental state of the outlaw. These interpretations added another layer to public discourse, framing the events as not only criminal, but also as manifestations of aberrant human behavior. Beyond moral or religious categorization alone, families affected directly attempted to reconcile personal trauma with public narrative. Diaries, letters, and oral recollections recorded the immediate horror as well as long-term consequences, disrupted routines, permanent injuries, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Children grew up with heightened awareness, their play restricted by fear. Adults navigated daily life with constant attention to potential threats. In this sense, the outlaw's influence extended far beyond physical acts of violence, shaping behavior, social structures, and cultural memory. Communities remembered both victims and the pervasive climate of dread, ensuring that the outlaw's legacy persisted in memory as much as in records or rumor. By blending practical adaptation, religious interpretation, psychological response, and media amplification, Mississippi communities developed a multi-layered reaction to sustained terror. The outlaw became not just an individual threat, but a symbol of vulnerability, unpredictability, and the fragility of safety in an environment already marked by isolation and hardship. Families, lawmen, and neighbors adjusted their behaviors, institutions evolved strategies, and the collective consciousness remained imprinted with fear. In this way, the outlaw's actions reverberated through the social fabric, leaving an indelible mark that would persist long after the immediate incidents ended. The tension in Mississippi reached its peak one oppressive summer night, when the outlaw's audacity escalated beyond previous attacks. A small plantation on the outskirts of Natchez became the stage for a confrontation that would cement his notoriety. The family, aware of prior incidents, had fortified their cabin, set night watches, and armed themselves as best they could. Yet, as darkness fell, a palpable unease settled over the property. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, the wind carried an eerie stillness, and even the livestock seemed attuned to a threat that human senses could barely grasp. At approximately midnight, a movement in the dense tree line drew the attention of the night watch. A figure emerged, tall, lean, and unnervingly silent. His presence was immediate, yet almost imperceptible, a spectral form blending with darkness. The family, alert but tense, observed as he moved with calculated purpose, assessing weaknesses, anticipating reactions. The outlaw's eyes, glinting in the faint moonlight, betrayed no emotion, only the precision of a predator fully in command of his environment. Every creak of floorboard and rustle of leaves became a prelude to violence, each amplified by fear, expectation, and the night's oppressive stillness. He struck with a swift, surgical precision that left little room for reaction. The father, attempting to defend his family, was incapacitated with a single blow. The mother and children, paralyzed with terror, witnessed the systematic collection of trophies from the incapacitated adults. Every gesture was deliberate, almost ritualistic, designed to maximize psychological impact. Neighbors who had gathered nearby to reinforce vigilance heard only distant muffled sounds, a table overturned, a chair shattered, a low deliberate scraping. The outlaw's actions were a blend of violence and calculated terror, each movement rehearsed, each pause measured to heighten suspense and fear. As the confrontation escalated, the family attempted to flee, yet the outlaw anticipated movement, blocking exits with unnerving foresight. Shadows danced across walls, distorted by lantern light, creating illusions of multiple figures, amplifying the family's sense of helplessness. Panic spread like wildfire. Children screamed, parents shouted, and the night itself seemed to respond with unnatural silence, amplifying the horror of each moment. The outlaw's presence transformed the familiar cabin into a theater of dread, where every ordinary object, doors, furniture, hearth became part of his psychological strategy. The neighbors, alerted by distant cries, approached cautiously. They found only evidence of struggle and the grotesque trophies the outlaw had left behind, each placed deliberately to signal dominance and instill fear. The family survived, but the psychological scars were immediate and profound. Survivors described the sensation of time stretching unnaturally, each second drawn out by terror, every heartbeat echoing like a drum of impending doom. The outlaw had not only inflicted physical injury, but had mastered the manipulation of perception, crafting an environment where fear itself became tangible. In subsequent days, investigators attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. Footprints, displaced objects, and witness testimony suggested a level of foresight and knowledge of terrain that confounded local law enforcement. The psychological impact on survivors and neighbors became a subject of informal study, with physicians and clergy noting extreme signs of trauma, insomnia, hypervigilance, and lasting anxiety. Stories circulated of families refusing to sleep in the original cabin, moving possessions, or even abandoning homes, demonstrating that the outlaw's influence extended beyond immediate physical acts. The climax of his campaign highlighted not only the brutality of his acts, but also the intelligence and patience behind them. Each attack was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of control, designed to manipulate perception, evoke terror, and ensure the enduring presence of fear even in his absence. The night of the Natchez cabin incident became emblematic of his capacity for psychological terror, a single actor, operating in shadows, reshaping the behavior and consciousness of an entire community. This crescendo of violence and manipulation marked the peak of the outlaw's influence, a moment when terror became both art and instrument. Survivors' recollections emphasized the meticulous nature of the attacks, the calculated selection of victims, and the deliberate placement of grotesque trophies. Communities collectively internalized the threat, adapting routines, reinforcing vigilance, and embedding fear into the very fabric of daily life. The climax revealed the duality of his terror, physical brutality combined with psychological dominance, leaving a legacy of fear that would outlast the immediate events, reverberating through Mississippi long after the outlaw vanished into the shadows. As the years passed, the outlaw who kept fingers as trophies faded from immediate public sight, yet his influence lingered like a shadow across Mississippi's forests and settlements. Families who survived attacks bore not only physical scars but deep psychological imprints, the memories of severed fingers, silent footsteps, and the cold calculation of a predator who vanished as abruptly as he appeared. Communities adapted to the persistent absence of the outlaw, but the fear he had instilled became part of local consciousness, transforming ordinary spaces, cabins, trails, rivers into loci of unease and suspicion. Folklore and oral history elevated the outlaw from criminal to legend. Parents recounted the stories to children, emphasizing caution, vigilance, and moral conduct as safeguards against unseen threats. Even decades later, travelers would whisper about the dense forests and winding rivers, where a shadowy figure might emerge, collecting trophies and manipulating perception. The story became embedded in cultural memory, a tale told as both warning and fascination, illustrating the capacity for human cruelty and the fragility of perceived safety. Speculation persisted about the outlaw's fate. Some believed he met a violent end in the wilderness, victims of natural hazards, or retribution by vigilante groups. Others suggested he disappeared to continue his crimes elsewhere, the true scope of his acts hidden beyond Mississippi's borders. Scholars and historians later examined the pattern of attacks, noting an intelligence and meticulousness uncommon for criminals of the period. While definitive evidence of his end remained elusive, the narrative itself served as a reflection on societal vulnerability and human fascination with deviance. The epilogue of these events underscores the interplay between environment, society, and fear. Isolated settlements, limited law enforcement, and dense natural landscapes created conditions in which terror could flourish. Communities learned to navigate uncertainty, balancing vigilance with daily necessity, yet remained forever altered by exposure to extreme psychological and physical violence. The outlaw's legacy was not merely a record of criminal acts, but a profound influence on social behavior, community cohesion, and cultural memory, demonstrating the long-lasting effects of fear on human society. Even today, historians and psychologists examining the case consider the outlaw's methodology and its impact on both immediate victims and broader society. Studies of trauma, collective memory, and folklore reveal the depth of his psychological influence, illustrating how terror can shape human behavior across generations. Communities adapted, survived, and transmitted cautionary tales, embedding lessons about vigilance, the unpredictability of violence, and the enduring imprint of human cruelty. In closing, The Outlaw Who Kept Fingers as Trophies exemplifies a dark chapter in American history where crime transcended immediate physical harm to manipulate perception, instill fear, and redefine social dynamics. The mystery of his identity, motives, and ultimate fate persists, leaving open questions that continue to captivate and unsettle. The epilogue serves as both reflection and warning that terror, intelligence, and opportunity combined can leave an enduring mark, and that the boundaries between myth, memory, and reality often blur in the darkest corners of history.